Hello, everyone. Good evening from my own side here in Oldenburg, Germany. My name is Chamakarita Bogo, and I will be co-presenting today's session with my co-fellow Laura Sena Mosquera, and together we'll be sharing insights into this topic titled Youth Voices, Global Futures, Reimagining Climate Advocacy, Climate Mobility through the Climate Mobility Fellowship. Okay, next slide, please. And so we are, like I already said, GCCM Climate Mobility Fellows, and we thought to give you a robust understanding of the fellowship we represent. We thought to introduce you to more about the Climate Mobility Fellowship. And so at a first glance, the Climate Mobility Fellowship is a flagship initiative of the Global Center for Climate Mobility. The goal is to equip youth leaders, young people with the knowledge, networks, and skills needed to drive climate mobility solutions. The duration of the fellowship is June 2025 to May 2026. It's a one-year fellowship, and myself and Laura, together with the other co-fellows, make up the inaugural cohort. So it's designed for 12 fellows from Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And so the fellowship revolves around four major pillars, and the pillars encompass formal learning in this way to capacitate young people, youth leaders on the skills, the knowledge required to undertake climate advocacy, climate action, increase awareness about climate mobility and dignified pathways in this sense. The next is to arm these fellows that we are a part of with hands-on GCCM program engagements. In this way, the youth leaders, the young people are provided with insights into how a global institution like the GCCM undertakes its work of promoting global climate mobility. Next is policy exposure. The GCCM does this through this fellowship by affording the fellows, the youth fellows in this regard, with the access, the possibility to engage in policy decision spaces. And we've seen this already with our participation in the Berlin Climate Mobility Forum, in the New York Climate Mobility Summit, and then from next week in COP. And then the final pillar of this fellowship is the applied project experience. Youth fellows are also helped in boosting their project management skills by proposing an impact project in order to translate the experiences we are gaining throughout the fellowship into our own local communities. Next slide, please. And so this slide is to basically share insights into what precipitated this presentation. As young people, and especially in the field of climate change and mobility, the paradigm, the status quo is that advocacy has been dominated by states and international organizations. But slowly, with time, with the proliferation or the boom in the social media, we are seeing more and more that young people across Africa, Latin America, but then also perhaps those even here have been contributing to reshaping this narrative, have been trying to translate their own lived realities into global advocacy. And so what inspired this presentation, and the central question that we hope to answer by the end of this presentation, is how do young people transform their lived experiences into effective advocacy for communities facing climate mobility issues? And what challenges and opportunities do they encounter in this process? Next slide, please. And so in order to undertake this study, we deemed it fit to conduct a qualitative research. We limited our scope to specifically the climate mobility fellows, which represents a microcosm of the youth population involved in climate advocacy in this regard. we employed surveys, reflective discussions across the 4 regions represented in the fellowship. But we devised this method because of the geographic distance between the fellows. We are located in Africa, some of us here in Europe, in Latin America, and the Caribbean. And so we had to devise a means to be able to collect data while also maximizing the periods when we had in-person meetings to discuss and also collate data. And so we triangulated the data collected with our fellowship outputs. We also deemed it imperative beforehand to establish the ethics and reflexivity that we applied in undertaking this research. And so first of all, we are fellows of the GCCM, and we tried to approach this research as more of a collaborative inquiry. We wanted to make it participatory. We wanted to, as a cohort, reflect on how we are working to translate our lived experiences into advocacy, and what the possibilities are, what the challenges we've experienced and continue to experience are, what the opportunities that spring from it, and most importantly, the role that academies such as this one championed by the GCCM is playing to help to amplify the voices of youth advocates, but then also to amplify the perspectives of the most vulnerable communities. And so we also approached this research, this presentation here, through the lens of co-producing knowledge. And we hoped that we would work together, and that is what we made sure to achieve. We worked together with the fellows, we recognized them as peers and co-creators, and we deemed it imperative to include this point because there is a lot of discussions around the paradigms, the terms on which knowledge data is collected from research participants. There is often the argument being put of knowledge data being extracted, and so we tried to approach this research undertaking as more an avenue to co-produce knowledge together with the co-fellows. And so we are aware of our positionality as researchers, as fellows affiliated with the GCCM, but then we tried to be aware of this position, and we worked to mitigate any bias, any thoughts of our objectivity being impinged upon by consulting external peers, triangulating the data we had gotten. And then we also, of course, prioritize ethical consideration throughout this process. Thank you. Next slide, please. And so I'm now delving to the heart of our inquiry of how youth advocates, and with the climate mobility fellows being in microcosm, how they translate their own lived realities into global discourses, the opportunities, the challenges as the case may be. And one of the first insights, the first themes that we emerged was the personal connection that youth fellows, youth advocates have to the topic of climate change and climate mobility. There was a consensus of the personal connection to climate issues, which led to, which provided the impulse for getting invested in advocating for these issues. And through this, we found that the youth fellows act as translators, taking terms such as loss and damage or climate mobility and giving them human meaning. This point is expanded on quite succinctly by this insight shared by a fellow that talked about how, in speaking of loss and damage, it's not about quoting reports, it's something that actually happened to the fellow's family, and its actual loss is incurred by this family. And so through this reflection, we are seeing that youths are transforming policy language into lived experience. And this dimension we found really important because we submit that the reason for the so-called policy inertia when it comes to issues pertaining to climate change, recognition of climate displacement, climate mobility issues, comes from the terms on which these issues are being looked at. They are looked at in some ways as something as an abstract phenomenon. But youth advocates, youth fellows are trying, especially in the fellowship, to bridge this gap by, honing in to the lived experiences of those at the front lines, and by extension, their own lived experiences. I take myself for an example. My own interest in climate mobility was stirred on a personal basis from my experiences as a young girl in Lagos, Nigeria, that experienced flooding, among others. And so this personal connection in some ways brings that human dimension that we find too often uh, missing when there are policy engagements and when they end up with the status quo remaining. And so we see that youths in this way are working to make sure that climate mobility is not just a global agenda. They are working to ensure that it is a story that foregrounds, the home, continuity, dignity, belonging, and this is something to take note of. And then the point also, the foregoing point illustrates how lived experience in this way becomes the foundation of advocacy. And this is what the fellows shared. There was a consensus in this regard about it. And in the next slide now, we will see the firsthand experience of a youth fellow. She talks about her entry into the field of climate change, climate mobility. And then after that, the next voice you'll be hearing will be that of Laura. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Wanisha Saunders and I'm a Climate Mobility Fellow under the Global Center for Climate Mobility. I am so honored to be a part of such an amazing fellowship. It all started with an intensive 2 weeks in Germany. And I always tell people when I started this climate change journey, it just was 2 years ago, the Bahamas faced a horrific hurricane, which was Hurricane Dorian. It shaped and changed the lives of Bahamians. And I just wanted to know more. After Hurricane Dorian, I started doing in-depth research. I became a climate change youth ambassador under the office of the Prime Minister. After that tenure, I became a climate mobility fellow because I always wondered to myself, what will I do, or what will my country do if it ever comes a time where there's a world without islands, where I would have to move from the beautiful Bahamas that I never want to do, by the way, but I just always want to know the what ifs. And I felt like the Global Center for Climate Mobility was given in-depth research, in-depth coaching, and an amazing fellowship that I wanted to be a part of. And listen, at the end of this tenure, we get to complete an amazing impact project. And I am actually so excited to reveal that, but it's a secret right now. But GCCM has been doing their endeavor best to guide us fellows, give us coaching, research, and everything that we need to make this process easy. And it's not always easy because some of us, we're from the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Africas, and it's just a whole bunch of different time zones. But the team here at GCCM, they make it happen. And I'm so excited to continue to support such an amazing organization, such an amazing fellowship. And with me and the other fellows being one of the first to complete this fellowship, I'm just excited to see those that will come behind us and the other improvements that will be made. And it isn't much to be made because it's been an amazing fellowship so far, and I'm just so proud to be a part of it.
Thank you so much, Shamaka. Can you hear? Everybody can hear me well? Okay. So thank you so much, Shamaka, for sharing this first part. I just want to start sharing you how the young advocacy, what is the practice, in the practice, what means the youth advocacy. So the first to say that young people are using creative and digital tools to share their experience around climate mobility, but also to mobilize around the world this agenda. We are using narrative stories as the storytellings, but also the social medias, arts, poesy, and try to connect the what we already know, what is happening in the territory, but also in the agenda of climate justice. One of the main point of this, for example, is that we have a very good group of young people in the fellow that have recognized that the climate mobility can be explained in so many ways, but probably from the storytellers, this is one of the main point of how to share what's mean climate mobility, as we saw before. So advocacy is very important because it's not only about how to share this experience and only and and how to express what we are living in climate mobility issues in our country, but it's also how to create changes in the system that are taking the decisions around climate mobility. So advocacy the function of the advocacy is to build coalitions, inspiring to the actions, and share this perspective around the world, because everybody is facing climate mobility from different perspectives. So through this kind of process, we have the possibility to share and to learn from each other. The challenge in around how is to be a fellow, but in general, we will say how is to be an activist for climate justice and for climate change, for climate mobility, is first around the limitation for the space. We already know that young people and the voice of the young people around the world is very important, and we have been so around the world the advance on include young people in the decisions, but we still have this big process and this big bridge around participation and making possible that not only we sit some young people in the tables, but the voice of these young people is taken in practice. So as we quote in this presentation, young voices invited for visibility, inspiration, and not for the implementation. So sometimes we saw that young people is just invited to the spaces, and we saw this very nice picture of young people in global spaces, but at the end and in the time to implement the actions, this is not coming to the reality. And this came with another point, is that, of course, the work of young activists around climate mobility is a very heavy emotional lawyers. We recognize that behind advocacy for climate mobility, there is also an emotional charge for everybody. And that's mean that sometimes without the support of the system and without the correct system to create these spaces around climate mobility and governments, is getting more harder to support the emotional ways that this process came. So the other point is the project-based funding and the short times. One of the main challenges for the young people around climate mobility advocacy is that most of the fundings for projects are short time. That means that when you are applying for a project, you have to choose between the needs from one community and just be focused in one project. And probably you are going to have just a couple of months to implement that. And in the reality, this is a process that needs more than just a couple of months. This is a process that we need probably years, and we need to create the base to develop these ideas. And this is not coming one day to another one. So even if we already passed the process to get the funding per project, when these kind of projects are with a lot of financial support, but also in a short time, this make a very more challenge the process. And the other point is the lack of recognition of legitimate knowledge for producers. As young people sometimes get in the place, most of them have this, the perception around is that we don't have the experience or knowledge to share solutions and to put it in practice. That means that sometimes we don't believe exactly what young people is saying, and it's just this idea of you are young, so this is why you are sharing this experience, but you already don't know what exactly we have to do. And this is a lack of recognition of a legitimate knowledge that the people have, because sometimes, as we mentioned before, the young people in most of the vulnerable places for climate justice are kind of translated of what is happening in the country. So they came to these big spaces to share what is happening, and this is a knowledge that is as important as the academic knowledge or the other information that we already have around solutions. So this, amount with the structural inequalities that we already know that makes the climate change can create like a big bubble for the influence of advocacy, and in the end that translates that the advocacy can be not as big as we expect in most of the cases. But as we start at the beginning with the presentation, and Shamaka mentioned before, the idea of this presentation is also sharing you how to turn this challenge into an innovation and how to create this gap that we already recognize in opportunities to create solutions, because at the end we already need solutions. We cannot stay only in the problems and in the difficulties that we already recognize. We need to start moving on, and the young people are already moving on, and the fellowship is a show of that, is a proof of that. So the first point is that we have been working from the creative way, and I think that this is one of the main point of the fellowship, the possibility that each of the fellow can create and can show in different ways the climate mobility solutions and the approaches for climate mobility. So, for example, there we have fellows as Shamaka that are working in podcasts, but we also, there is some group of fellows that are working in poetry. When we were in New York in the summit, in the climate summit of GGCM, we share some poetry around climate mobility in the Caribbean part and what is the impact of that. And I think that was very powerful to share the experience, because sometimes we believe that behind this kind of topics we only have to speak in a very academic and restrictive way, and we forget that at the end this is a human right discussion. This is a discussion that touch our emotional, our family, our believers. So this kind of creating ways to share also and to create dialogues and speeches around adaptations through creative ways is a very important way. We are also we have fellows that are working in short films. The idea of them is also to share the experience from the young people that are in their own territories. The other part is that for these fellows, it's very important to connect through different parts of the world, and this is why we are in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Island, in Africa. And the idea is to create networkings between each of the fellows, but also with other organizations around the world that are working in climate mobility. So for that, GDCN have been doing an amazing work trying to connect us with academic, but also with people from the NGOs, with governments, and create this partnership that can open the door for innovation and for visibilities. Requiring climate mobility through justice and knowledge. One of the main point of this is how we can start thinking of climate mobility for an justice perspective, and recognize, of course, that climate mobility is included in this big bubble of climate justice. And the first point is recognize that the knowledge of young people is very important in the narrative, but it's also very important in the order to create solutions. The advocacy becomes in two ways. First, how to communicate, and the knowledge in that communication. So as part of the fellowship, we have been taking course for communication and how to share our stories in the best way. That also means that we have the opportunity to create products and knowledge around climate mobility from a very creative ways, as I mentioned before. I don't know if at this point Shamaka would like to add something
Very well,
else.
yeah, very well explained, Laura. And so basically what we are trying to say, in addition to what Laura said, is it's been established so far in the preceding slides that young people, and especially within the scope of our research, the climate mobility fellows encounter enormous challenges, and we have tried to transform this into innovation, into possibilities. What young people do, what youth do, is to leverage on social media, on creative endeavors as their tools for advocacy. And so we see youth in this sense, defining their problems, mobilizing solutions through narratives, through the stories that are told, through the perspectives that are amplified, through leveraging social media to amplify these perspectives. And by undertaking these efforts, the youths are claiming space and asserting themselves as legitimate knowledge producers, as Laura has explained earlier, but then advocacy, demobilization, and taking power through advocacy in this way becomes a way of communicating lived realities, perspectives, but then also creating knowledge that is too often sidelined. And that's why the idea of justice and knowledge comes in, because whose idea is often sidelined? Who do we listen to? Who do we regard as a valid person, a legitimate person that can be listened to, that has something credible to say? And too often the youth are consulted, but when it comes to implementation, to transformation, to action, they are sidelined, or we in this regard are sidelined. And so it's about how the youths are leveraging the tools that we do have in our disposal to make an impact, to advocate. In this way, youth advocacy is utilized in this way for youth to reclaim knowledge, to reclaim space, to reclaim agency, to reclaim dignity in a space where often their perspectives are sidelined, infantilized in this sense. And so we see ultimately that youth-led advocacy is reconstructing legitimacy in this sense in climate governance through, the efforts getting undertaken. But then Laura will continue after this, and then I can step in again. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamaka. So at this point, one of the main points for us to also share with you is what are the benefits behind these kind of academic programs, and what is so important for us that the fellowship of GCCM is also an example of how to multiplicate or create the same spaces for other young people around climate mobility. And the reason why this kind of spaces is important, because first is a way to convert advocacy into potential access, visibility, and influence. And as we shared with you before, as part of the fellowship, we have the opportunity to be part of bigger spaces of the COP, as the climate summit. But more of that, I think that in the everyday working of a fellow, we also have the opportunity to connect with people that want to share and to give the visibility around climate mobility in a different perspective that the academic fields is always doing. And this is very connected with the second point, and is provide mentorship. We believe that even if the young people already have knowledge for climate mobility for our experience, we recognize that we still need to learn more as everybody around the world in one topic. We still need the spaces to get to recognize and to have this knowledge exchange. And one of the for me as a fellow in the personal way, I think that one of the main points of the fellow is the capacity to share experience and to know what is happening around the world. I'm from Colombia and Shamak is from Nigeria, and I haven't heard signs until she shared with us what was happening in Nigeria around climate mobility that probably is very similar to my country, or probably is in an opposite way. But at the end, the knowledge and change behind these kind of topics is what creates solutions that can be implemented and can be shared. Because sometimes we believe that probably it's our own problem, and the problem is only in Colombia, for example. But the reality is that around the world, there are other communities that are also facing the same. And when we put together this knowledge, and when we put together this context and these problems, is also an opportunity to create solutions across the regions. And this creates solidarity and across regional solidarity. The third point is to boost policy literacies and system thinking for sustainable impact. As a fellow, we will be working in papers, but also in policy brief. And the idea of this is give us the opportunity also to put in rights knowledge and learnings that we already have for policymakers. And we believe that with this point, the academia is trying to put together the creative part that we already shared, the capacity building or the idea of mentorship, but also the capacity to give something that can be in a long-term use for the climate mobility agenda. From representation to systematic transformation. So this part for us in our presentation is very important, because even if we don't have the answer yet to the main question that we present at the beginning, we recognize that we need a very big transformation of the system in order to create a space for young people to advocate. And that means that advocacy must move from symbolic participation to inclusion and systematic transformations. And in the practice is that even if we are inviting, even if we close the gap that doesn't allow young people to be in tables, it's not just to have young people sitting at the table, it's also have the opportunity that these young people create solutions for climate mobility. This is the real transformation in the system that we need. Also, that require a sustainable and inclusive and infrastructure in the build for young people in the decision making. And in the practice, that means that all the challenges that we already shared with you as the financial challenge, the emotional way that is behind this can be something that we discuss, but it's something that we can create further solutions. And the third point will be the fellowship demonstrate that participatory justice in actions is one of the best way to change the system. We are not just only there to share the stories and only to share what is happening, and the storytelling that, as we mentioned, is very important, but we are also there to create transformation and to try to take this, what we already have, in the actions that our community needs. So Shamaka, I will give you the word in case you also want to add something.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. And so I think what we have tried to, it's tying back to our research question, how do lived realities translate to effective advocacy? And that's a reflection that we had when we met with other co-fellows, and that is something that we have tried to keep at the back of our minds. And so far, we have established that lived realities are translated to advocacy, first of all, through utilizing, social channels, creative endeavors, whether podcasts, poetry, art festivals, as is being conducted in the Pacific Islands and in the Caribbean. But then we also recognize that there is a need for more to be done. And that's where youth academies like the GCCM Climate Mobility Fellowship play a very instructive and important role in this regard. And we bring it forward as a model that should be replicated, because what it does is that it arms young people with the access, which is a major fundamental issue that has been provided or highlighted. Laura has talked about it. So it's by providing mentorship opportunities, peer-to-peer exchanges, regional solidarity through discussing with fellows from different regions, understanding the commonalities and the uniqueness of the vulnerabilities in different regions. It provides a good launching pad for the youth advocacy of youth to be amplified, for their work to be visible, and for that to translate into influence, as the case may be. And so what we are saying ultimately, however, is that this advocacy, and the level that it is being done, while commendable, there is room for more. We are unsure if somehow this advocacy, and from our experiences in our own local communities, if it's translating to systemic transformation, in this sense, in the lives of the vulnerable ones in our community. And so far, it seems that it is not as effective as it should be. And that is something that we are taking with us as a reflection. But what we are calling for is that, advocacy and effective advocacy, it needs more. And part of what it needs is from symbolic participation, for infrastructures to be put in place, for recognition to be offered to youth, to ensure their true inclusion, right? And this also requires, in a lot of ways, requiring or embedding infrastructures that enables the representation and the inclusion of the youth in decision-making spaces. But we are saying, regardless, that the GCCM Fellowship, we are bringing it up as a model that can be replicated in other forums, but then it shows basically what participatory justice in action looks like. We talk about voices being excluded, voices at the peripheries in vulnerable regions being excluded, but then through innovative models like this, it provides an opportunity for youths from these regions to be represented, for their capacities to be strengthened, for them to gain access, for them to be able to engage to strengthen their systems thinking skills, to get an insight of the intricacies of the international politicking involved in these topics of climate mobility. And that's something that we bring forth as a model that is worth replicating. And that ultimately, you know, the youth, through these participatory methods and the support provided, will be effectively able to shape systems and not just tell stories, which is the status quo now. And so far, what we have managed to demonstrate is that the youth fellows, which is the microcosm, remember that's our scope, that they have lived experience, that sometimes it's the lived experience that even compels advocacy. And then that with this advocacy, creative means, strategies are deployed, narrative storytelling are deployed, social media are deployed to translate to influence. But then for transformation, it is not at the scale in which we want to see it. And that is something that we take with us as a reflection. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Shamaka. And I just want to add in this point that at the end, even if we are not looking this representation as main point of climate justice, is the simple, what is so important for is for a very simple reason, is because everybody is going to be impact for climate crisis around the world. And that means that young people needs to create the capacity and needs to be part of the spaces when the solutions are created. If we don't open the space, even not only for climate mobility issues in general, for what is means climate justice for everybody, it means that everybody around the world is going to be impact for the climate crisis. And at the end, we are part of the solutions, and we have been part of these solutions, and we are creating these solutions. So this is why it's so important to recognize that process of the fellowship in GGCM are not only related with climate mobility, are in general related with the opportunity to open a space for new solutions to the people that at the end is going to live the consequence of the crisis that we already live in, but at the end is going to be more and more in the future. So answering the research question, we would like to be very concrete in the questions and what we found. So the first one is how young people are transforming lived experience into advocacy, and this is by translating local realities into a global narrative in a very creative ways through networking strategies, sharing next stories, but also creating solutions. We have a co-fellows that are from Fiji, and they are working with children, sharing what is climate justice, what is happening this in my country, because for us it's very common to talk about climate crisis and what are the impacts. But when we go to our communities around and you ask everybody in the street probably, what is climate crisis? What does that mean in your quotidian life? Probably the answer can be very shocking. And this is a very big gap that at the end doesn't allow us for a very active adaptation solutions. So this is why the translation of the local realities into agenda narrative is so important. The second point is what are the challenges do young people face? And as we mentioned, the structural exclusions and of course these enable fundings and the emotional fatigues around the activities for climate is big. We already know that be very connecting with this story, and everybody that you at every time that you have to share this story again and again is very hard, and at some point you feel very frustrated when you are sharing your story, when you are creating solutions, but these solutions are not getting amplified in their reality. The other point is what are the opportunities that we have, and this is innovation, solidarity, and create these leadership platforms as like climate mobility fellowship, because it's the opportunity also, as I mentioned before, to share this knowledge. Probably I'm from Latin America and our experience is very different. Even if we are in the Caribbean, this is very different at the reality in the Caribbean countries. So the opportunity to share this experience give us this solidarity that we need for climate justice and we need for climate mobility agenda. And what does it mean? That young-led advocacy reframes climate mobility, amplifying the voice of young people, but also the voice of a lot of vulnerable people that are around these topics. toward the end, we would like to share for you the call to actions that we believe that are part of the solutions. So I will start just point out that recognize the young voice as co-creator of the climate governments is very important. We can expect to change the systems if we don't believe that young people are part of the solution and are part of the governments that we need for climate justice. And the second is invest in long-term young-led networkings and bringing this local reality with global policy. In order to create more sustainable solutions, we need that the project doesn't stake in a consultant that is just for a couple of months and a project that are focused just in 2 or 3 topics. The idea is that around the project that are leading that are leading by young people, we have the structure, the financial support, and the networking support to create a solution in a long term. And I will give you the floor to Shamaka just to share the last 2 points.
Thank you, Laura. And so our third call to action is for the integration of youth knowledge into formal decision-making, which we are still not seeing, and then to move decisively, concertedly from consultation, continuous repeated consultation, to actual co-creation, to devise, to enact, to agree on, to effect and implement solutions with the youth and not for the youth. And so we thought to conclude on this note based on the insight from a fellow that the next chapter of climate change and mobility in this sense will be written by those who live it. And our task is to ensure that their words become policy. And this is what drives us, this is what pushes us, this is what fuels our agitation, and we hope for effective action and change for the better. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamaka. And thank you, everybody, for being here. If you have any questions or comments, we can. I think that this is the space to share it. Thank you so much for your time.
And you do not have to share questions per se. If you want to contribute, if you want to share reflections or comments, you're also welcome to do that. Thank you.
I think that if we don't have any question, we just want to invite you to follow the GGCM accounts and social medias, because through that you can also know the other work, the amazing work that our co-fellows are doing around the world. This is also an opportunity to know more about the Global Center for Climate Mobility, to know what we are doing as a fellow, but also as an organization. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Shamaka.
Thank you, Laura. Bye-bye.
Bye.